speakers who'll cover a range of topics. We'll start with Saba Rouhani, who'll share research findings about de facto decriminalization models in the United States. Next, Fordham will share lessons learned from decrim advocacy over the past 20 years, including how messaging has evolved and the need for collective action to push back against rollbacks or to confront rollbacks. Following Anne, Palaniappan will discuss how mobilizing key constituencies is advancing the decrim agenda in Malaysia. And finally, we have Ganna, Dovbakh, who will be highlighting how a broader movement coalesced around decriminalization with joint advocacy to protect civil society participation. So starting with Saba, I'll just give you a quick intro. Saba Rouhani is an assistant professor of epidemiology at the New York University School of Global Public Health. Her research focuses on the impacts of drug policy and policing, on health, racial inequities among people who use drugs, and the wider communities. So Saba, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. I was about to say who I am, but you've done that for me. So thank you all for being here. I know it's the very end of the conference, and many were on the dance floor last night, so I appreciate you showing up today. Okay, and I just wanted to say that I'm presenting this research on behalf of many, many, many incredible people, some of whom are in this room, but not all. So just wanted to start with that. So I think we all are aware of the sort of devastating consequences of the war on drugs in the United States and beyond, so I won't go too deeply into that. But what I will say is that in recent years in the United States, barring very recent political developments, so just rewind a little bit, I think amid the kind of devastating death toll of the overdose crisis, alongside an increasing appreciation of policing, and specifically racialized policing, as a public health crisis in its own right. So as these things have been happening, there has been an increasing appetite to reform some of the more draconian drug war measures, and specifically to reduce the exposure and the frequency of interaction between people who use drugs and the criminal legal system in the US. So we began to see several reforms being introduced, and one of those is decriminalization, which, just as a reminder to everybody here, it does not actually, under decriminalization, substances are not reclassified as licit substances, so they remain illegal, but possessing them is no longer a criminal offense. And so again, we're not dealing with issues of the drug supply, of regulating sale or consumption, of taxation, anything like that, but we are trying to reduce the frequency of interactions between people who use drugs for possessing or using drugs with the criminal legal system. And that's been pursued in two ways in the United States in recent years, probably, the better known of which is in Oregon, and Oregon decriminalization was passed through the legislative model, the de jure model, which involved an actual change to the law, which decriminalized all illicit substances under different specific thresholds. But in a number of other jurisdictions in the US, they've also been pursuing drug policy reforms, decriminalization, and others through a mechanism called de facto drug policy reform. And that relies on prosecutorial discretion. So folks just simply deciding within their own jurisdiction, prosecutors have unilateral power to not charge, to not criminally charge any crime that they choose. So it's important to note that prosecutorial discretion in and of itself is not new. Every prosecutor has several cases that appear on their desk, and they are constantly choosing which to pursue based on resources that are available and their administration's priorities. But what was a little newer that we started to see was the kind of deployment, the organized deployment of prosecutorial discretion explicitly to approximate social policy change. And so you had a series of self-proclaimed progressive prosecutors in the United States really coalesce around certain policy objectives that they had, reducing drug criminalization being one of them. And this kind of took hold following the pandemic as well. In the events of 2020, there was public concern about infection control in jails and prisons. There were mass social movements happening in the US. There was appetite for prosecutors to say, we're just not going to allow people to enter the system for low-level drug crimes. And I just, it's just interesting to note within the wider context, this isn't only used for drug policy. Right now, what we're seeing is an increasing use of this method to not prosecute crimes related to seeking abortions in certain settings. So it's a wider movement. And another thing I just wanted to point out before getting into our research is that there are some very, very key differences between this model and the legislative model. One of them being that, of course, prosecutors can work to secure buy-in from people in other sectors, but there's nothing that codifies commitment or funding for other forms of services under a de facto decriminalization model. All they have the authority to do is just not charge cases. So that's important, and it's important in contrast to what happened in Oregon and elsewhere where actual other services are being invested in at the same time. There are also implications for policing under a de facto model because the prosecutor can only choose not to charge crimes. Police technically still have the right to arrest people and bring them to central booking, at which point their cases will be dismissed. So that's a possibility. And then lastly, again, when you're enacting legislation, necessarily there's some groundwork that needs to be done, some consensus building, and there is a written law that comes out of it at the end, so it's somewhat transparent. Under a de facto model, policy provisions can be completely unwritten. You may never actually know what the policy is, right? So that's a very key distinction as well to keep in mind. So these, as this started to happen in the US, it got our research group and many others thinking, like, what, given that these policies are not transparent, that they're sort of being developed at the whim of these elected prosecutors, what are the policies that they're actually implementing nationally? So that was our first question. And then we zoomed into one particular setting in Baltimore City, which I'll cover some of the early evaluation that we've done in that area as well. So our first research question was, we aimed to characterize the policy typologies of de facto decrim around the country. We are not sharing the specific locations of every jurisdiction included, actually because some of these places were operating in sort of a clandestine fashion and they did not want to be identified. But we have, pretty good geographic spread around the country, and we interviewed staff. We interviewed elected prosecutors themselves and their main policy staff, and then we also interviewed national experts who are providing technical assistance and doing advocacy around more responsible prosecution practices. And I don't have time. We actually used a framework to really dive into the drivers of why people were adopting these policies, what was driving their decisions, what the provisions were, which I don't have time to go through all of it, but I think a key finding that we had is that there's extremely, extremely different models being implemented. And again, a lot of them are being developed without a harm reduction or a health expert in the prosecutorial office. And they varied really significantly. So we kind of grouped them into three bins, the first being what we called unconditional declination, and this was the model that most closely approximated like a full de jure decriminalization model. So this was found in jurisdictions where they just had a blanket declination. We will not prosecute any simple drug possession charge, irrespective of what the drug is or who, whether that person had a criminal record. There are no conditions. The second group were those who they also had like mass declinations to prosecute. However, those either only applied to a single substance, so unprescribed buprenorphine or psilocybin, or they were, they said to us, we can show you we are declining 100 times more cases than we ever have before, but we're making that decision on a case-by-case basis. So much less transparent. And then the third group also said to us, look, we're not prosecuting low-level drug possession. However, rather than go through this declination approach, what we're doing is we're basically relaxing all eligibility requirements for diversion programs, and we're also seriously relaxing the completion requirements for those programs. So we're exploiting diversion infrastructure to funnel people away from the system. And then across these models, there was an additional layer of variation based on whether there were threshold limits in place. Many places had them, many places did not. Whether these policies were at all disseminated to the public, if they were formalized, whether there was any built-in referral or linkage system. And honestly, for that one, most programs did not have that, except for those that relied on existing diversion systems. And then lastly, there was variation in whether any of these offices were retroactively applying, which has obviously major implications for racial equity given the disparate policing of drug possession so far. And so we also pulled out a couple quotes of key challenges that policymakers told us that they were facing. A lot of them will be familiar to you, like they're very kind of a lot of the same salient challenges that harm reduction and policy, drug policy changes meet regularly. So a main one being law enforcement buy-in and cooperation. We heard a lot about law enforcement being perceived to undermine the policy. And another being, what was perceived to be extremely well-funded, organized political backlash and sort of well-planned campaigns to unseat the elected prosecutors based on these policies. And together this also translated into a real sustainability challenge. So of the 14 jurisdictions that we worked in for this study, at least a third of them have had their prosecutors either not reelected or actually unseated mid-cycle or seen their policies overturned. Okay, so I'm gonna give, I'm now sort of switching gears to dive into our experience examining this a little bit more closely in Baltimore City. And so Baltimore had one of the most public de facto decriminalization campaigns of all sites, which is why I can kind of identify them as one of our study sites and more publicly evaluate what they did. Baltimore, for those who don't know, highest rate of overdose deaths nationally, and a really, really deep, like very, very deep legacy and very complicated and painful legacy of racist policing, really difficult relationships between the community and the police department and the state's attorney's office in this setting. And in this setting, this was in April 2020 during COVID, the state's attorney announced that she would pursue a full unconditional de facto decriminalization model. It was very public. It had buy-in from the mayor's office and the police, and she did actually pursue retroactive quashing. So this was sort of the most, from a policy exposure perspective, this was like the strongest policy exposure setting of all of our sites. And so we first sought to just look at, did arrests decline? Given what I said about the challenges with police, did arrests even decline during this time? And then we spoke with people who use drugs and police officers about their experiences under this model. So again, I don't have time to go into all of our findings, but I pulled out, I think, what some of the things that are important to me that we discovered. One is that we did see, the discerning among you will notice that the policy implementation time point is exactly during COVID, so this is not a causal analysis by any means. Likely due to a combination of COVID and the policy, we did see arrests decline significantly. I will say we looked at several other arrest categories, and we also looked at this over time, and we saw those declined less and they recovered more quickly. So we do feel that there was some impact of this policy on specifically keeping drug-related arrests low. And we saw that the majority of declines were observed in the Black community, but both before and after the policy change, there were really staggering racial disparities. Essentially, after the policy change happened, there were no arrests happening for drug possession among other races, and the very few that were happening were exclusively in the Black community. And then I pulled out some of the sort of interesting findings from our qualitative work to share with you as well. And one was that across both samples of participants, there was really broad agreement. Actually, there was more universal agreement among police officers that arresting was a waste of time, that they were not interested in going back to a model where they were arresting for low-level drug possession. So there was broad agreement about this. However, that did not translate to endorsing the decrim model, and both groups of stakeholders had a lot of issues with the decriminalization model. And from the perspective of people who use drugs that we spoke to, one of the main reasons is that it did not change the nature of police interactions. So they said just because we're not being arrested, it doesn't mean that we're not having, basically horrific interactions with police, that we can trust police, that we're still having our drugs taken away, we're still having harassment, sometimes during calls for service. So that was kind of one major thing. I'm sorry I can't read all the quotes right now, but I wanted to put them up there. And then another was that they actually, many of them expressed a desire for better policing. So they said, okay, yes, we don't want to be arrested for low-level drug possession, and also we don't want the police to just stare us down or stay in their cars. Like, we have real safety concerns in our neighborhoods. We, too, are the citizens that need some functional model of public safety. And that we heard over and over again. And then lastly, I mean, police had a lot of different, as I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of different complaints about this model. One of which was that they felt constrained. They felt that they didn't have the discretion to like maintain public order and move people out of certain areas and into other areas. But many also actually said that they felt it compromised trust with the other community members. One officer told us a story about like an older Black woman who he had a good relationship with prior because he would help her, clear people off of her stoop, and the trust with her was completely gone. And somebody else gave us this quote that said, to the community that it didn't affect, they loved it, this was great, this was progressive, but to those who lived in that area, they felt that it was a slap in the face. They felt that they lost part of their protection. And I'm just gonna end by saying that policy also was overturned, and so we're doing more research in the area, trying to examine what recriminalization looks like in Baltimore City. And thank you so much. Good, yeah. Okay, you continue. Okay.
Thank you so much, Saba. In the interest of time, I'm going to save questions for later. But next, I'm going to introduce Anne Fordham. Anne has been the executive director of the International Drug Policy Consortium since 2011. She previously held several roles on drug policy and harm reduction. She has a master's degree in human rights from Sussex University, where she specialized in human rights and harm reduction. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Theshia, and great to see you all here, because we thought we'd have 3 people, given that we're near the end of the conference and it's after lunch. Yeah, I'm really excited to be part of this panel and to have these important conversations. I really feel like it's been a beautiful gathering of our movement over the last 3 days, and it feels so needed in this moment of such political turmoil and geopolitical fracture that we're all seeing. Yeah, so happy to be here with all of you. So IDPC, for those of you who don't know, quickly, we're a global network of around 190, oh, sorry, I need to press it on here too. NGOs from 70 countries. We're working to amplify and strengthen a global movement to repair the harms caused by punitive drug policies and promote just responses. And we work hard to facilitate civil society engagement in drug policy spaces. And you can see we have family gatherings wherever we meet. So this was the IDPC Network's members meeting yesterday morning at 8 a.m. So you guys are gluttons for punishment. So my presentation today is, yes, as Theshia said, it's really to talk about our decriminalization advocacy, a bit of background, where we've come from with it, where we're going with it, the challenges that we're currently facing, and how we might shift our messaging and our narratives. I think what we did well, which I'll start with, is that we really worked hard to have strong, sustained advocacy for decriminalization. And we started to see a trend towards governments taking up the debate, moving towards decriminalization initiatives around the world, and a growing global and UN consensus that decriminalization of drugs, possession for personal use and drug use is the way forward and needed. We started to evolve our messaging as this happened. We, as IDPC, I'll talk about a bit about in a minute, we came up with a gold standard for decriminalization. We needed to provide greater technical detail and capacity strengthening. And then, the world, prohibition was still going on in the background. And, I don't know, I will take responsibility also in my advocacy. I don't know that I kept up with what was happening in terms of the drug market and the pushbacks. So I think, maybe what we need to do better, and that's what I want to talk a bit about today, is articulating a decrim kind of 2.0 in a deepening crisis of prohibition, the clear failure of capitalism that we're all facing, and reframing narratives and resistance. So where did we come from? IDPC has been advocating for decrim since we were set up in 2006. And we really started to urgently articulate the harms and failure of criminalization. This was very strongly linked to HIV/AIDS advocacy. In fact, in 2009, the UN Secretary General on World Drugs Day declared that he urged all countries to remove punitive laws, policies, and practices that hamper the HIV response. And he noted that in many countries, legal frameworks institutionalize discrimination against groups most at risk. So as far back as 2009, that messaging was starting. The other thing that we had to do back then was establish that the decriminalization of drug use and possession for personal use was permissible under the UN drug control treaties. And that was something at the time that was not accepted clearly. So we really had to lay that out. And then, as I said, as governments got more interested, we had to get more technical on the details, what did the model look like, and we had to start tracking some developments. And just a shout out to my colleagues at Release who really started to do that work back in 2012 and again in 2016. And this led to like a decrim map that you can follow on Talking Drugs, where we work together to track these developments wherever they're happening. And then, of course, consider the decrim position across the IDPC network, gain consensus among our members, also on the model, how it should work, and do training and capacity building. So that's kind of where we've been. And then I think, the success has been, building on that global sort of high-level, UN-level support for decriminalization from all of these institutions over the years. And I also want to credit Palani, who's on the panel with me today, for adding Global Fund very strongly to that list when he worked there. So we're building support and consensus. We also have now, across the UN system, lots of human rights bodies and mechanisms coming out and speaking in favor of decriminalization, making it very clear that we cannot continue to criminalize people for the use of drugs or personal possession of drugs. And, this is an impressive list, and it's taken a lot of advocacy from many colleagues, many of whom are sitting in this room and beyond. So the jurisprudence, in fact, I would call it, from the UN human rights system is really clear. And in parallel, we also got, on the UN Common Position for Drugs, it really means that the 31 UN entities are signed up to this. So that was a huge win in 2018 to get the UN Common Position on Drugs that specifically mentions the need to decriminalize. However, I still would say that UNODC are not quite there yet, although they do sign up to the UN Common Position and lead it. And this is a paper that you can still find online that they did try and release in 2015, but then rescinded it and still felt like they couldn't say it so openly. So we're still pushing for that. So more and more countries are moving towards decriminalization. It is a trend that we see. And you can see here that, out of the 59 jurisdictions that we have, half of these happened in the last 10 years. So it seems to be an accelerating trend. Of course, as we heard earlier already, we know that models vary and that, in many cases it's far from perfect. And that complicates our advocacy, right? Because ultimately it is a red line for IDPC. First and foremost, we want full decriminalization. So for us, we developed the gold standard of decriminalization, that's what we call it. And the idea is, absolutely to have all sanctions for drug use removed, criminal or administrative, and for all substances as well as related activities. So activities of what we call, say, low-level supply, social supply, personal cultivation as well as personal use. Promoting voluntary access to systems of care and support, meaningfully involving people who use drugs at all stages, of course, in the design, monitoring, and delivery of these services, of harm reduction services. Importantly, and this has not happened everywhere where decriminalization has been instituted, to expunge previous convictions and develop reparations for affected communities. Train authorities to ensure implementation and adherence, like everyone who needs to be involved understands what the policy says and how to implement it properly, especially the police who often remain involved in decriminalization policies. And then, of course, the funding issue, right? We cannot decriminalize and then not put any funding into healthcare and harm reduction and drug treatment services. So quickly, How does decrim work? This is what we say. Which drugs are decriminalized? All drugs. Which activities are decriminalized? That's what I was sharing earlier, not just possession for personal use and drug use, but also the other associated activities. How do we know if it's possession for personal use? I'm running through these so quickly, but you can read it in our decrim guide or come and talk to us later. Of course, the thresholds are always the thorny issue, and they must only ever be indicative when we're trying to decide if it's for personal use or for supply, but complicated. And also complicated is who decides if it's for personal use. This is also very complicated, but in a no sanctions model, arguably the police have the discretion just to leave people alone, unless another crime might be suspected. But all of this was happening, I think, while we were working on this in a deepening crisis of prohibition. And we were very much focused on making our arguments for decrim, arguing for the different models, really trying to get information out there, capacitate the network to talk about it. And of course, the overdose crisis or, the crisis of a toxic, unregulated supply continued unabated in the background. And then, of course, the HIV/AIDS epidemic still continues. I mean, UNAIDS reported in 2022 that the risk of acquiring HIV was 14 times higher for people who inject drugs than for people in the overall population. I mean, and that's a direct result of criminalization and lack of access to harm reduction services, the stigma, the discrimination. I mean, the overdose crisis in North America, or the increasing overdose deaths, is devastating. And I think I don't really need to repeat the numbers in this room. I think you're all aware of that. So when we're advocating for decrim, and then some jurisdictions are taking up decriminalization in this context, and we're arguing still on the basis of it's about the right to health, and it's about ensuring we reduce stigma and discrimination. But I think it got, perhaps potentially, I'm not sure. I think we have to take some responsibility, and I'm not criticizing any colleagues for how we talked about it, but that we overpromised somehow what decrim might deliver because we were so enthusiastic about it. We needed it to work. We wanted it to happen. And we ended up, for so many reasons, so many complex reasons, facing this backlash against decriminalization that we see today. Okay. And, I think, we've been hearing about the US, of course, with Oregon, with BC. In both cases, there were powerful and problematic disinformation campaigns to undermine these initiatives. Decriminalization was blamed for massive structural problems that also coincided with the COVID pandemic, especially this is the case in Oregon, a housing crisis, evictions, poverty, inequity, and of course, ultimately, an unregulated and toxic drug supply. And actually, despite this, in both cases, even in the short time that the policies were implemented, there were clear beneficial outcomes, right? Decrim works. In Oregon, there was a massive reduction in arrests for drug offenses, as well as increased funding for health services. And in BC, the same. Arrests for possession fell by 76% in the first 6 months of decriminalization, which was exactly what we wanted it to do. But it's just one part of the response. And the driving forces behind overdose, homelessness, and public use remain unaddressed by decriminalization. And then, of course, in the background for this, the Portugal example, which was always the model that was held up, was also then being subject to questioning and scrutiny and blamed for public drug use and, we don't feel safe. And why? Why do we have public drug use? Well, there's a crisis of homelessness. People are unhoused increasingly in all the jurisdictions that we're talking about. Homelessness has massively increased. And thank you for this report from the Global Commission in 2024 that where I've got this slide from, which you can also check out. It's called Beyond Punishment from Criminal Justice Responses to Drug Policy Reform. And it's contagious. So Kokila, I'm so glad you're here. I'm sure you may recognize this. But this is the Central Narcotics Bureau of Singapore. Their website, which somehow is like in celebration, it seems, for Drug Victims Remembrance Day, now outlines, you can go there and outlines the problems of drug liberalization, and then there very clearly Oregon, British Columbia, Thailand's there actually too, you see on the side, because they have a sort of cannabis liberalization policy. But yeah, they're using these arguments. Our detractors are using this against us. So we have to re-clarify the objectives and the impact of decriminalization. What can a decriminalization policy address, right? We have to be super clear about that. Stigma and discrimination, improving access to health, harm reduction, drug treatment, alongside adequate funding, reducing interactions with police and the criminal legal system, ensuring the right to health, of course. But it won't fix a toxic drug supply. It will not fix a housing crisis, and it will not address the underlying structural issues of inequality, poverty, gender, racial discrimination, the damaging colonial legacy, and the failure of capitalism. So what do we need to do now? We need to not be on the defensive. And then I was like, oh my God, the title of my presentation. But, that's where we still are, right? Like sometimes I get asked questions by journalists. They're like, why didn't decrim work in BC? And I'm like, well, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, wait a minute. I'm not going to answer the question like that, right? Decrim worked. So we have to be so clear about our language. We need to be clear about who and what has caused a crisis of unregulated and toxic drug supply. Decrim cannot be the scapegoat for over a century of prohibition that drives drug markets in ever more harmful directions. We need decrim, but we need so much more. We need to advocate for drug consumption, safe injection sites, drug checking, safe supply, legal regulation, alongside housing, employment, education, and addressing structural inequality. And we need to be in solidarity within our sector and across the globe and across other sister movements. Just some resources that we have. So please visit our website, the interactive map that I mentioned on talking drugs, our advocacy guide on decriminalization, a briefing that we've done. And we have an e-course as well that has been, over 1,000 participants have gone through it. We're currently lacking funding for it, so its future is a little uncertain, but we're going to find a way to continue it. Finally, just wanted to say in closing that, we're living in such a moment of deep political uncertainty and rising political danger everywhere. All of our work, all of our communities are under attack. So please, let's be in solidarity with each other, with our sister movements, with dear friends living under fascist regimes around the world. The future is not written. Nothing is inevitable, and we are not powerless. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Next, we have Narayanan. Palani co-founded the first harm reduction program in Malaysia in 1991 and led the National Harm Reduction Pilot Program between 2005 and 2007. He was the senior advisor on harm reduction at the Global Fund, and he's the director of Drug Policy Program, Malaysian AIDS Foundation, and SKPA 2 program. Palani, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm from Malaysia, truly Asia. It's nice to see so many Asians here today. Thank you. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of Malaysia. We have a very harsh drug law, actually 3 different harsh drug laws. We used to hang people a lot. And then in the 1990s, we had a heroin epidemic, and HIV was very high amongst people who use drugs. But in 2005, we developed a harm reduction program that brought down HIV epidemic from 80% among people who use drugs to now about less than 1%. So we have we really have really did good. We're very proud of that. But since 2010, there is a big shift from heroin to amphetamine, and that's threatening all of the benefits of all of the success that we've had on harm reduction, because people are using drugs, injecting, and it's affecting men who have sex with men and transgender communities who face double criminalization in a Muslim country like ours. So we really feel that changing the drug laws, advocating for decriminalization and drug policy reform is important to sustain the successes that we've had around harm reduction. So in 2018, my beloved boss, Adiba Kamaruzzaman, many of you would know, and myself and a few others got together and advocated to different ministers, and we, managed to get the cabinet-level discussion on decriminalization. But then in 2019, 2020, the government changed. There was an election, and the government changed, and everything went quiet again. This is a very familiar story in many of our countries. And then in 2023, having left the Global Fund, we managed to secure a small amount of funding from a Global Fund multi-country program to get me back into Malaysia to set up a secretariat and work on decriminalization. And that's where we are right now at pilot program. And I just want to walk you through this process and talk a little bit about the lessons that we've learned in advocating for decriminalization in a country like Malaysia. So this was the start of the discussion in 2018 when we joined forces with different academicians and community activists, a civil society movement. The seed was planted in 2018 when we started this. The strategy was to build a secretariat of concerned individuals and start a courageous movement, because we know that this is a story of David and Goliath. 7 decades of investment in law enforcement means that law enforcement and the drug control agencies are very, very powerful. And so if we are going to do something around decriminalization, you have to be incredibly courageous to start this movement. The objective was to reform the Dangerous Drugs Act and address other laws, and particularly to support the Ministry of Health to take charge of decriminalization, because it's a health issue. This is our little setup. We have an advisory board and a secretariat that is based at the Malaysian AIDS Foundation. Now, when we set this up, we decided we needed to be very, very clear about what we're going to do. And our program was very clear that we were going to work on 6 areas. Number 1 was to build national ownership. That this cannot be a bipartisan issue. This cannot be a partisan issue. It cannot be the government's issue, not the opposition's issue. It needed to be everybody's issue. So we needed a national ownership. The second one is to look at all of the laws that was criminalizing and to try and list out what and how we need to change those. The third was to ensure that the whole country, which has had 7 decades of people telling them that drugs is #1 enemy and people who use drugs can only be treated in incarcerated setting, that mentality needed to change. And so we needed to figure out a way of building this capacity and changing that mindset. The fourth area was based on what's happening around the world, that we talked about the housing crisis. If you take people out of incarcerated setting, where would they go? What are you going to do about that? So we needed to ensure that there were enough treatment facilities that people can go to if you're moving them from incarcerated setting. The fifth area was to ensure that we have new systems, particularly decrim structures. What do they mean? Yeah, well, how do we build those structures? And last but not least, making sure that this is very carefully designed and monitored, because there are so many detractors There are so many people who can say, no, it's not working, and then that we have one chance. If we fail this, if we mess this up, we'll be set back 20 years. So we know this. So we set out very clear objectives as to how we're going to achieve this. So the national ownership, we learned from our harm reduction days that bringing everyone together at a national committee was critical, absolutely important. We needed a government-level committee which brought together the law enforcement, the religious leaders, the women's department, the community activists, everyone at the same table. And we achieved this in June 2024 when our Minister of Health set up the National Task Force on Decriminalization for Malaysia. So very excited about that. And so we provide the technical guidance on that. So that's the first meeting chaired by the Deputy Health Minister. And then we went into a 3-day workshop with everyone, with every partner, and the consensus built was that yes, we should do decriminalization, but we need to be very careful. We want to avoid the mistakes that were done, sorry, Saba, in Oregon, and that we need to ensure that this is done through a pilot programming. So we've got consensus now to have pilot programming. That alone was very, very exciting. Then we went on to look at the second area that we want to do is looking at the laws. So we have these 3 laws, Dangerous Drugs Act, Drug Dependence Act, and a horribly titled Registrar of Criminals and Undesirable Persons Act, which as soon as people are charged on Dangerous Drugs Act, they then registered for the rest of their lives as criminals and undesirable person. How dare they? Undesirable persons. Okay, the third area is capacity building. So if we want to change an entire nation's view of drug users and drugs, well, how do we do that? How do we go about doing that? So we needed to then segmentize the society as a whole, and then we decided that these were the 5 areas that we were going to focus on. Parliamentarians, NGOs, community-based organizations, not just drug NGOs, but also women's, children's, human rights NGOs, media, particularly because of the language and the damage that media can do, and they are the voice of the community. Religious organizations in a country like Malaysia, it's incredibly important because they are thought leaders. And then last but not least, law enforcement. So we decided to focus on these 5 areas, and then we went ahead and did strategies to address each of those 5 different stakeholders. I won't go through this, but it was a lot of work in the last 2 years. The fourth area is treatment and ensuring that people have places to go if they came out of prison. So we did a treatment gap analysis, and we found that in Malaysia there are around about 600,000 people who are dependent users. Out of that 100, if we calculate everything, the number of beds that we have in Malaysia is only 12,000 to about 120,000 people who might need inpatient treatment. So the gap in Malaysia is like 110,000. How are we going to address this? This advocacy is really important to try and ensure that the Ministry of Health was investing further in treatment facilities, not just the Ministry of Home Affairs with mandatory drug treatment facilities. The 5th area is building these structures, the Malaysian model. One of the big questions we had is oftentimes, is this a Western model? Decriminalization is a Western model. And I keep going, our first law is 1952. That was before our independence. That was the Western model. That's the leftover of our colonial masters. Like, come on. Yeah. But we still have to address this issue of a Malaysian model. So we've had a number of a roundtable with public health experts to develop a Malaysian model. We are going to Portugal to visit Portuguese model in next month. And then we're coming back and developing an M&E framework for a Malaysian model. Just going to go quite quickly on the pilot program. We need a pilot program to ensure that the Malaysian model works, that it can work in Malaysia, and to understand what are the challenges and what are the risks that can come out through the implementation in Malaysia. So we've chosen 3 sites, one in the East Coast, West Coast, and East Malaysia, based on the availability of services and stakeholder agreements. So we are hoping to implement these pilots next year for a whole year with a careful set of framework and indicators that we could then present to the government. It takes a whole village, so I just want to acknowledge all of our international partners for supporting us, including the Global Fund, Open Society Foundation, Monash, UNODC, all of these partners who are with us on this. Now, I know that I'm going to run out of time, so please feel free to cut off the mic. We've now come, we've had a national task force. We're now at a stage where we're going to do a pilot program. And there are still a number of challenges that we have to address, particularly from law enforcement. Everyone seemed to agree that decriminalization of use is okay, but decriminalization of possession, So there is a really big understanding around decriminalization of possession, which the police seem to think that if we have a threshold, people will go ahead and start selling below the threshold. It's like, come on, that's your biggest problem, So we try to address this by saying that you could use the resources that you don't use for low-level drug dealing to bigger level drug dealing. We try and talk about that, but we still need to address several of these concerns. Another big concern, another big challenge that we have is over the last 7 decades, because of what I said, the investment has gone into Ministry of Home Affairs to strengthen the National Drug Control Agency. The issue of drugs is not seen as a health issue, but more as a national security issue. And that's a really big challenge to address and to overcome. So there is a political struggle between the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Home Affairs, who say that, no, drugs are our #1 enemy, and it's a national security issue. So I have 2 more minutes. Okay, so here we are. A number of lessons learned. This is about, doing decriminalization is really about rocking some gravy boats. So many people are so happy with the status quo because the current system is so corrupt. It provides income for so many people at every stage of law enforcement. And to try and talk about that is extremely sensitive. And it's extremely difficult. But we need to try and address that, and we need to try and talk about that in a sensible way. A lot of the people who benefit from this are also very powerful. So sticking your neck out is, it's going to be a courageous thing to do if you are going to set up an civil society advocacy movement. There is, one of the things that we find also is the voice of people who use drugs has been so diminished because of the stigma, because of the laws, because of the incarceration, that even when we have people at the table, the level of intimidation from law enforcement agencies towards people who use drugs is so high that one of our big advocacy movement has to be in supporting people who use drugs to have the voice to talk about the abuses that they have been through the criminal justice system, including in mandatory treatment services. Okay, I'll be very quick. So, number 1, we need to start. Because if you don't start, then if you need to set something up. What we found is that once we've had the Secretariat, more and more NGOs, more and more stakeholders have come on board and said, yes, we want to add the voice, but somebody needed to start. Number 2, alliances with other agencies and be very clear about how human rights relates to decriminalization, how women's issues relate to decriminalization. We recently had a women's consultation where we talked about wives of people who use drugs, mothers whose children have been incarcerated, what are their issues and how those relate to and why they must get involved in decriminalization. Get more people to talk about your talking points. Very often people go, oh, that's just Palani talking about drugs again, or, you know, being liberal again, or that's Adiba doing her spiel on liberal progressive drugs. No, I think one of the success we've had is getting other people to talk about decriminalization, including religious leaders, community leaders, or other activists. So giving your talking points and taking a backseat is a really great idea. Be prepared with evidence and data, particularly around, oh, it's failed in Oregon, so it will never work. And so being very conscious about, okay, what Oregon achieved and didn't achieve, and what were the factors that contributed to that is very important. Helping the Ministry of Health, because it is the Ministry of Health's role to take this up. As a civil society, we're not going to change the country's laws, but the government that owns it, Ministry of Health that owns it, will. And so helping the Ministry of Health is really important. Okay, so inshallah, by 2028, we might have decriminalization implemented in Malaysia. We wish us luck. Thank you to everyone who helped us, and hopefully this is a model for developing countries and Muslim majority countries. Hopefully we can clarify and don't hide behind enabling environment as something that we need to do. Let's be very clear that we need to change the laws. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Palani. So our final speaker is Ganna Dovbakh, who is the Executive Director of the Eurasian Harm Reduction Association, an organization that unites activists and organizations across 28 countries of Central and Eastern European and Central Asia. Ganna is a community advocacy and health programs expert. She's originally from Ukraine and holds a master's in social psychology and a master's in cultural studies, and has authored numerous trainings, research, and publications. Ganna, thanks.
Hello, everybody, and I need to say that I had numerous comments to what colleagues said. And I will start with 70 years, because with our region, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, we are uniting organizations and activists from the region where we already have had 108 years of security power. Because KGB, like, we could call the Russian Empire from the Soviet times, from 1917, as a KGB empire. So that's important factor which unites us as a network, because all of our activists from 1997, when the network was formed, actually, with every step of their work in developing the harm reduction programs, were fighting with this security factor. And now you're sure that this security factor is back with the horrible war aggression. But if it's not only the war against Ukraine, it's constant war against civil society and human rights in every country they could reach with the political power. And I mean Russia, and it's absolutely clear that they have planned clear plan on how to regain the KGB empire and how to have more countries occupied. So that's without question, and that's the context where we are trying to speak about decriminalization. So when when we start speaking about decriminalization in our Eurasian consortium, and here I need to mention Robert Carr Network Fund, whom financial support we lost, unfortunately, and who is now in a big crisis, but our Eurasian consortium was supported for a lot of years in our work between different communities. When we start working on this decriminalization issues, the first problem we understood within our membership, and we have a lot of 280 members only our network, and we are working with the 5 networks of different communities, we understood that we are, in our advocacy, we are reacting on the crisis. So, okay, there's a new law and we need to do advocacy. But when we are asking ourselves what is the world we want to have without criminalization, we can't understand this. That's why we go through this scale of decriminalization understanding, and I will not repeat it because Anne described it very well. The only difference is that we were going through this scale together with LGBT communities, together with sex workers. And you could imagine who worked with the sex worker networks that decriminalization and regulation is not good words in their lives. Because they have different models already tested through 200 years, and that's why in our joint advocacy we needed to find the proper language. But we divided what we want to have as a scale of achievement, but and the bottom line, and we start doing it in 2023 when it was not such heavily affected the legal opportunities and security for NGO and activists. But nowadays we are mainly addressing this. And we are constantly answering the questions to ourselves and to our members why we need to do it together, because it's absolutely different legal frameworks which regulate sex work, criminalized HIV transmission, or drug policy. And each area is very big, very broad. But we recognize between ourselves that when populists are attacking us, they are attacking us together. That's a point, that they see us as the group. And they like to divide us and say, okay, we will do something on HIV transmission, the cream, if you want us, but not drugs. Or we will do something about the LGBT because it's criminalized only in 2 countries in our region, but it's still criminalized. The homosexual relations between 2 adult men still criminalized in 2 countries of our region. But in other countries, they could say, okay, if you are not going to Pride, let it be, live your life, but not about drugs, not about sex work. So we have the same, we are gathered already in the same ghetto by populists, and we have shared challenges, and that's why we need to learn from each other. And some communities are rather faster than other, let's say, in strategic litigation, for example. And when we spoke honestly in one of the meetings with sex workers, we in the drug policy realized that they want more. They want to decriminalize the taxi driver who is helping them in a way. And we say, okay, well, we never thought that you could go so far in the target setting about all infrastructure, and that was surprising. And we are addressing the same institutions, and usually politicians who are like-minded, they could be like-minded in a different ways because they are really sharing the values of human dignity. So we don't need to divide them on different areas. And actually we needed the solidarity because in one country it could be only a couple of activists from sex workers community and couple of activists who from LGBT opens and even not always open activists. So we developed the movement. We decided to do this together. We start thinking about the target setting, how we could see the task of decriminalization in the future. Again, it was supported by Robert Carr Network Fund, and we are grateful to this amazing initiative, and we will miss it very much. And we agreed through the course of this. You could not imagine how much we talked. And that's important process about each term, about target setting, how we understand in each of the community, is it right time to raise these questions? Should we hide under the HIV movement? Should we talk only about human rights but not about the crime? And all of these issues. But what we agreed, there's non-negotiable issues. And for us, it's not easy decision, because if we are putting sex workers' rights, as our dear colleagues and dear partner, Sex Workers' Rights Advocacy Network, SWAN, regional network, insist on, then we are losing potentially majority of feminist organizations in the globe as allies, because they have very strong position about sex work. The same was the LGBT, and the same with majority of issues. But we decided, as for now, that our Rise Decriminalize movement will be together, and this is avoiding some issues. It's not possible for us. And yes, we have some principles of speaking, and one of them about funding. So we need to be very careful about from whom we are taking funding. Now, when we have none of the funding, like it's easier, but to be careful. But we'll see, and that's also important experience for us as a regional networks, not to compete for funding, but try to work together and to come together. It's not always easy, but that's important gain of this Rise Decriminalize campaign, which we have to go together. And now I'm going to the key point about the foreign agent law, and we as EHRA, we almost undesirable organization, not undesirable people, because we were not declared yet, but we could expect at any moment, and that's Russian law. And that's the technology. For us globally, we need to understand that it's very clearly developed technology how to control civil society. And we are not only speaking about drug policy, civil society, or LGBT. It's all like-minded, human rights oriented, based on the values of dignity, civil society, starting from investigative journalists, independent media. We are all together, and that's very clear technology, which was developed in Russia in something around 2012, and now exported, sometimes even just clearly translated from Russian to Kyrgyz. It's exported to Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Hungary, could be exported in Bulgaria, Serbia, and I will show the map where we are, and that's the big map, and somewhere it's already done, and somewhere it's just warring system around this shrink. We don't know the good name. It's criminalization of activism. Criminalization of human rights. It's not shrinking space, because important point is that this space is shrinked only for these specific organizations. There are plenty of patriotic groups who are receiving presidential grants, who are receiving huge amount of money from domestic funding. Patriots, even healthy lifestyle, like plenty. So if you agree to get this money, then you will be forced to avoid some language, and in this way you are in that area. So they know what they're doing. Very, very fast and very sad story about Georgia, one of the most democratic countries. actually, Kyrgyzstan and Georgia attacked now by Russian populists, and they were the most active civil society developing countries in our region. A lot of communities are developed, and now they already voted not only foreign agent law, but also FARA law in addition to this. So you need to be registered as a foreign agent, and if you are receiving more than 20% of your funding is going from foreign sources, and then there are a lot of criminal liabilities. We don't know how it will work, but what we know that it will definitely work if the government will not change, and government is very, very controlled by Russia. And that's not my word, it's a word of people who are standing in the streets every day and night for 150 days already, like every night. And you could imagine the charts of almost 1 million people deciding who could go. If somebody from Georgia go into your international meeting, then other people will stay on the street. And together with this, it goes anti-LGBT law, very severe, and it means that the organization who are providing services for LGBT people, first of all, they need to report as a foreign agent, and they need to report all the personal data of all beneficiaries, meaning beneficiary of money. So all social workers, all peer workers, all recruiters for survey, they need to be reported with personal data to the state. In the same time, it's law which banning to provision of the services to LGBT. And what our Georgian colleagues are saying, that they could have fine for not reporting these cases of each of the client around 2,000 euro. So each of the client could cost the organization the fine of 2,000 euro for not reporting. And coming to the West, European Union, and we are not sharing now the position which we will ask you to sign in the next week when we will be ready, because Bogotá took a lot of our energy and we are not ready with the position, but that actually for you to know that Hungarian parliament introduced the changes into constitution about the gender and drug policy criminalization. So that's actually about supporting what Anne was saying. We need to have new narratives, because actually we all know that addiction and the mental health issues, it's everyday reality of every person in this globe right now. And this mental health diversity is actually the new norm, but unfortunately we didn't bring the dependencies and addictions as a part of this narrative. And I think that we need to think about it a bit more, and that's what, it's not only me who is thinking, but we as a European networks of people who use drugs and harm reduction networks already decided to do new narratives, but we don't have funding, and that's about it. So we're really now on the age of disappearance, and I'm saying not only for Eurasian Harm Reduction Association, but about Eurasian Network of People Who Use Drugs, Eurasian Women Network on AIDS, and Eurasian Coalition for Health Rights and Sex Diversity, ECOM, and Sex Workers' Rights Advocacy Network. All 5 our networks are now like cutting the staff costs severely. And we don't know how we will survive, honestly, because all our funding, it's either European or US, even through pool funding like Robert Carr or Global Fund, it's still very dependent. And hopefully we will survive.
Thank you so much, Ganna. So I'm sure you have a bunch of questions, and in which case, I think there'll be a mic that'll be passed around. So can we maybe just see from the audience how many people? Okay, so we have a question there. Oh, we have a bunch, because, all right, so we'll start with you since you went first, and then we'll keep track of remaining people.
Thanks to all of you for a wonderful last session of this 2015 HRI convention. My question is for Saba. I'm Louis Letellier de Saint-Just. I'm a lawyer in health law back in Canada, Montreal. When you mentioned the situation in Baltimore, it was, of course, reassuring knowing that the mayor's office and the police director were supporting that. We all know that when we go that way, or if we go to decriminalization, or if we go to diversion, police officers are key elements. I'm curious to know what kind of training they had. Because in BC, British Columbia, Canada, when Decrim arrived in January of 2023, 45 minutes on the video. For the rest of Canada, under diversion program, nothing.
Thank you for your question. And I saw you speak at ISSDP last year in Montreal, so it's lovely to meet you. So they didn't get any training in Baltimore, is the very short answer. There was a memo that went around. However, when we spoke to police officers, the knowledge of the policy was sort of universal. I think there was buy-in from the police leadership. There was knowledge, but not a lot of buy-in from police officers. Another important part of this context was that actually in 2015, there's a young black man named Freddie Gray killed by the police in Baltimore, and this same state's attorney actually prosecuted 6 police officers, charged them with homicide. And so this police department and this state's attorney's office were in a multi-year war, and there was a lot of extreme animosity against her and her policy before it rolled out. So we were actually quite surprised to see the reduction in arrests, again, definitely precipitated by COVID, but I think within that context, it was very interesting that police officers did say we don't want to arrest, but we also will circulate to the community that everything that is going wrong is her fault. We will do everything that we can to sabotage her individually as a personality. But the last thing I will say about that is that in speaking to many of these officers, we did actually identify, and I don't think she's in the room, but we have somebody named Laura Sisson who's leading some work on this. We identified quite a few who did express buy-in, but were just telling us that we don't have anywhere to send people. Like we don't, all of the services close early, or they're open 2 days a week, or, so I think we have a long way to go with police training, police buy-in, yes, but we also just have a system whereby those who are bought in, those early adopters and those who are motivated actually have their hands tied oftentimes by a broader infrastructural failure. And the US being somewhere where we don't have good social services and they're getting worse every day, nothing about my talk was meant to say that decrim, it doesn't work or is bad. I just feel that it's necessary but not sufficient. And I think that actually some officers shared that view.
Sorry, hello, my name is Matt Southwell from COACT, which is a technical support agency. In 1999, I gave a speech at the Geneva Harm Reduction Conference. The conference decided to have a session on drugs prevention, which as a drug user rights movement, we thought was completely contrary with the harm reduction movement. In order to as part of our participation at that conference, we asked for a counter speech called To Protect a Human Right, or To Prevent a Human Right, sorry. And it was a very interesting speech. At that point, half the audience gave us a standing ovation and the other half sat stunned and horrified. Senior drug policy harm reduction figures said they will be dancing in the streets of Vienna tonight because they thought we were so foolish to come up with this model. And I think it just really highlights why people who use drugs need to be at the heart of these changes. If we look at cannabis law reform in the UK now, being done purely in the interests of commercial interests, while drug users, you can buy expensive cannabis off often people who used to be involved in government, but you can still be prosecuted for growing your own as someone with a health condition. So I think we have to think about how do we decriminalise as a stepping stone to regulation, because the big wins come when we release the money from the prison system, when we start to earn the profits from taxation. And I think we have to, I think one of the changes has to be How do we see decrim very clearly as a stepping stone? And because that's where the big wins are, and not feel unapologetic about that. 26 years ago, we couldn't persuade half the audience in this conference that human rights-led strategy was the right thing to do. So let's continue to be ambitious.
Marianne from Australia. Matt, you actually I had two questions. One of them was, where we stand on decrim, what about a pivot to let's just be bold and not fight yesterday's war but tomorrow's one and argue for regulated supply? So my second question is, what are views around the differential changes for different drugs? So I would argue, if we're going decrim, that we do decrim of all drugs so that we don't have a hierarchy of the good drugs and the not so good drugs. Yet in reality, certainly in my country, and I would argue around the world, we're very much moving forward on cannabis, but not on other areas. I have concerns that that is going to lead to a hierarchy of the good drugs, and therefore the good drug users, the bad drugs and the bad drug users, and then it will stall reform in other areas. But an alternative argument is, yes, but you've got to embrace change wherever it's coming, and therefore we should get behind it. I'm just interested in the panel's views.
Who wants to take that? The drug exceptionalism question, and does it set the stage for future reforms?
Thank you for the question, Marianne. Yeah, I think it's problematic, personally, to have drug exceptionalism, and that's, you see that in the kind of principles that we have as the IDPC network, that it's all substances need to be decriminalized. And otherwise I'm sure many of you have been to other conferences, and it's been really challenging, like talking about the cannabis movement. I went, early days, I went to a few cannabis conferences to try and convince them to kind of be more in line with the principles of the broader harm reduction and drug policy reform movement. And they, I had a lot of maybe things have changed now, I'm not sure though, 10 years ago, where they were pretty aggressive towards me because they were like, well, we don't want to talk about the junkies. We're not junkies, we smoke weed, and honestly, I've had similar experiences at other more, kind of single issue drug conferences as well. I'm not going to go into it because I don't want to call anyone out, but really unwelcome in those spaces. They're like, why are you here? What we're talking about here isn't drugs, or whatever. So personally, I think, going back to the point, no one is free until all of us are free. I don't think we can go along with drug exceptionalism, and we should always be questioning it. Why aren't we decriminalizing all drugs? And then, to your first question I still think it's relevant, preparing for this presentation today, there was a decriminalization pre-conference at the weekend. Also last week, I was asked to do some media work around BC because of the upcoming election. Well, thank God that did go in a better direction. Thank you, Donald. But suddenly I was very clear for our advocacy, we have to be talking about safe supply and ultimately legal regulation, however that looks. I have some anxiety about talking about legal regulation because, of course, the other challenge that's coming, and we heard that very clearly from Kojo Karam in the plenary, corporates are going to get, they're already here. They're already getting into bed with us. So, I'm like, decrim safe supply, maybe that's where it's at. I'm not sure. But certainly we need to regulate the supply, however that looks.
Tatiana Deshko, Alliance for Public Health, Ukraine. I would have two comments. One is adding to this beautiful constellation of speakers and of really change makers in drug policy. I would like to mention the Global Commission on Drug Policy and the Regional Commission on Drug Policy. For Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it's been an opportunity to involve the very high-level advocates on the top levels of presidents to this discussion and change law in Kyrgyzstan and to reverse the closing of IT program in Kazakhstan, or to get very, very close to decrim in Lithuania. So this is a mechanism that I think would be adding a very, very important effort to our work. And maybe the second one is related to some opportunities that may be arising amidst crisis. And coming from Ukraine, we are seeing that there now, amidst war, are new opportunities to get to better drug policy in Ukraine. And it is during war that Ukraine has legalized medical cannabis, that Ukraine became part of CND, that now we are working on a strategy. There is still a battle to be fought to get to a good drug strategy, but this is again an opportunity which is coming amidst a very challenging, critical and crisis time. So keeping on this more of optimistic drive, maybe while the world is talking tariffs, maybe it's time for us to make a deal on decrim. Yeah? So some new opportunities to open and to look into. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question, and actually right in the front. And then I'm going to give the mic to Palani, who'd like to add some stuff.
Thank you. My name's Neve Eastwood. I'm from Release. And I have a comment and a question. And I think the idea of decriminalization and regulation being divergent policy choices, that we have to opt for one over another, is actually the wrong approach. We have to opt for both. And it has to be regulation based on social justice and racial justice. I mean, so I think Canada is a really telling example of that, where we continue to see the criminal law being applied to people operating outside the illicit market, including in relation to possession. So we have to fight for both of these things, and also recognize how the tentacles are in so many areas of our lives that it's not just the criminal law we're fighting, it's the civil laws that are impinging. But for Saba, the policing piece. So I was really interested in the data that you had on the reduction in arrests during COVID, because in fact in the UK, we saw an increase in stop and search exponentially during COVID. This was for drugs, largely for cannabis possession, so targeting young black men in urban areas. And you mentioned the other areas that you looked at in the US, and I was just curious, was that a pattern that you saw across those areas, or was it specific to Baltimore? What was going on? Because I think there's an argument here around the role of policing in public health, that if we have police officers undermining public health objectives, which they do every day, but it's particularly crystallized in those circumstances. So what else was happening?
Thank you. That's really interesting. In the US, we did see in the short-term declines in arrests kind of across the board, because there was such a reduction in both street drug activity among housed populations, although not among unhoused, but also the police. The police just weren't policing, and the courts were completely paused. So we did see an immediate reduction in arrests in a lot of different settings. We did not see that for other crimes as much as we saw it for drug crimes in areas that decriminalize, which is why we feel with some confidence that the decrim policies, and that applied to Oregon. There's also, in Oregon, that the phasing in of the decriminalization occurred a little bit after COVID, so we actually saw sort of a stepped pattern. So we did see COVID-related decreases and then significant additional decreases with decrim. So we feel confident that some of the drug-related decreases in arrests were indeed due to these policies. In a lot of areas, they started to recover, though, slowly. And we saw in Baltimore, when we compared across different crime categories, that all of the other crime categories recovered much more quickly. So again, there seemed to be some lingering effect of the policy. And the only other thing I'll say is that I know that policing of congregating and 6 foot, social distancing rules and mask wearing was highly racialized. So there were pockets of increased policing for other things, but low-level drug possession seemed to just no longer be a priority in that immediate post-COVID period.
I just wanted to address Matt's and Marion's points. The thing around people who use drugs and the advocacy by people who use drugs. The phenomenon is, if you're a current drug user, you're a devil. If you have given up drugs, if you've gone through rehab, you're an angel. That's very much the perception in Malaysia. And in countries like Malaysia, there is networks of people who use drugs are networks of people who have given up drugs. And they have a really strong voice, but unfortunately, one of the things that we have is that the self-stigma is so high that at the table at meetings, people seem to take on the arguments by the law enforcement. That yes, if I can give up drugs, why can't you? And so we have this real discussion with networks of people who use drugs around possession of drugs, and even members of these networks don't quite accept that we can decriminalize possession because they feel that people who use drugs should be able to give up and not be walking around with. So I think in terms of our advocacy in the community, we really need to work with the groups of people who use drugs, who have given up drugs and who have that voice and who have that connection. And I think we're not doing that very much. Networks of people who use drugs seems to want people who use drugs to be part of the network and not these other members who have given up. Marion, I really struggle with the argument around should we be fighting for regulation and legalization or legal regulation of drugs. I think the reason why we are advocating for decriminalization is because it is a lot more. It seems to be a really big shift from very harsh laws, where the country has had very harsh laws, to saying, okay, let's legalize or let's regulate all drugs. Whereas when you talk about decriminalized use, and this is what's happening to communities and families of people who use drugs, and people who use drugs need to be seen as patients and health issues, that seems to be somehow more acceptable. And the advocacy messaging seems to be received better. But I still really struggle with how do we package regulation as what we need ultimately to do. How do we do that is still a struggle for us in terms of our advocacy messaging. But rest assured, that's not out of the realm of possibilities to talk about. We wherever we can, we talk about that. But if you have any suggestions at all as to how we can do that in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, that would be incredibly helpful to do. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Palani. So if you would indulge me for just a moment, I know we're at time. I want to see if Ganna has anything that you want to add. No? So we're at time. So thank you so much for your questions, and thanks to this amazing panel. Can you please give them one more last round of applause?